in the winter of 1946 or the spring of 1947. The exact date has never been definitively established, and the specific uncertainty is itself characteristic of a discovery whose every detail has been debated with the passionate intensity of scholars for whom the stakes are as high as they get. A young Bedouin shepherd named Mohammed Edh was looking for a lost goat in the limestone cliffs above the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. He was approximately 15 or 17 years old. He was a member of the Taramireh tribe, the Bedouin community whose seasonal movements between the Judean desert and the Jordan Valley had given them an intimate knowledge of the cave-riddled limestone escarpment that rises above the Dead Sea shore in a series of dramatic cliffs and terraces. He was doing what shepherds do, following the animals, checking the terrain, moving through a landscape that his tribe had been navigating for generations. He threw a stone into a cave opening in the cliff face. He heard something break. He did not go in immediately. The caves in this region had a specific cultural reputation. They were associated in Bedouin tradition with spirits and with the specific dangers of places where the boundary between the ordinary world and the supernatural world was thin. He came back the next day with a companion. They crawled into the cave. And they found, in the dim interior of what archaeologists would later designate Cave 1 of Qumran, a collection of tall cylindrical clay jars, some intact, some broken, and inside the intact jars, wrapped in linen, ancient scrolls. The scrolls were dark with age. They smelled of the specific mustiness of ancient organic material preserved in the specific microclimate of a desert cave. The Dead Sea region is the lowest point on Earth, its air so dry and its temperature so stable that organic materials that would have decayed within decades in any other environment had survived for 2,000 years in a condition that allowed their contents to be read. The boys took some of the scrolls. They were not sure what they had found. They kept them in their tent for a while, hung them from a tent pole. They showed them to other members of the tribe. They tried to sell them in Bethlehem. The scrolls were offered to a variety of dealers and scholars, passing through a series of hands in the specific chaotic manner of a discovery made in a politically unstable region at a politically unstable moment. Palestine in 1947 was on the verge of the events that would produce the Israeli Declaration of Independence in May 1948 and the Arab-Israeli War that followed, and the specific combination of scholarly significance and political sensitivity that would eventually make the Dead Sea Scrolls, the most contested manuscripts in the history of archaeology, was already visible in the first months after their discovery. A Syrian Orthodox bishop named Metropolitan Athanasius Yeshu Samuel purchased 4 of the scrolls for a relatively modest sum from a Bethlehem dealer. He showed them to scholars at the American Schools of Oriental Research in Jerusalem, where a young graduate student named John Trevor recognized immediately what he was looking at, and recognized it specifically because he had recently been studying ancient Hebrew manuscripts and had a visual familiarity with the script that most scholars of his era did not. He photographed the scrolls in February 1948, producing the first photographic record of the most important manuscript discovery in the history of biblical scholarship. Simultaneously, the Hebrew University scholar Eliezer Sukenik had purchased other scrolls from the same original cave through a different dealer, conducting the negotiation through a barbed wire fence at a military checkpoint in November 1947 because the political situation was already deteriorating to the point where movement between Arab and Jewish areas of Jerusalem required crossing military lines. Sukenik immediately recognized the scrolls as genuine ancient manuscripts and as potentially the most important archaeological discovery of his career. The world learned about the discovery in April 1948, when the American Schools of Oriental Research published the first photographs of the Great Isaiah Scroll, one of the scrolls purchased by Metropolitan Samuel. The announcement created the specific electric combination of scholarly excitement and popular sensation that major archaeological discoveries occasionally produce. This was not merely a find of historical or archaeological interest, but a discovery that potentially touched the most fundamental questions about the origins of the world's 2 largest religions. The Isaiah Scroll was the most complete ancient manuscript of any book of the Hebrew Bible ever found, a complete copy of the entire book of Isaiah, 54 columns of text, written on 17 sheets of parchment stitched together into a scroll approximately 7.5 meters long, dating to approximately 125 BCE, more than 1,000 years older than the previously oldest known Hebrew manuscript of the same text. 1,000 years older. The gap between the oldest previously known manuscript of Isaiah and the new Qumran scroll was not a matter of decades or even centuries, it was a millennium, and the specific question of how accurately the biblical text had been transmitted across that millennium was one of the most fundamental questions in the entire history of biblical scholarship. The answer the scroll provided was both reassuring and instructive. The Great Isaiah Scroll was approximately 95% identical to the Masoretic text, the medieval Hebrew manuscript tradition that underlies virtually all modern translations of the Hebrew Bible. 95%. The transmission had been astonishingly accurate. The 5% of variations were mostly minor, spelling differences, word order variations, a few significant textual differences that biblical scholars have been analyzing and arguing about ever since. The specific combination of confirmation and complexity that the scroll provided, confirming the general accuracy of the textual transmission while revealing specific variations that required explanation, was exactly the kind of result that changes a field forever. But the Isaiah scroll was only the beginning. The search of the caves that followed the initial discovery, conducted partly by the Tarahumara Bedouin, who proved consistently faster at finding new caves and new material than the professional archaeologists, motivated by the commercial value of what they were finding and the specific knowledge of the terrain that their traditional relationship with the landscape provided, revealed, over the following decade, 11 caves containing manuscript material in the Qumran area alone. Cave 1, the original cave, contained 7 major scrolls including the Great Isaiah Scroll, the Community Rule, the Habakkuk Commentary, and the Genesis Apocryphon. Cave 2 contained fragments of biblical and non-biblical texts. Cave 3 contained the Copper Scroll, one of the most extraordinary and most debated documents in the entire corpus, a scroll made not of parchment or papyrus but of thin sheets of copper, inscribed with a list of 64 locations where enormous quantities of gold and silver were supposedly buried. Whether the Copper Scroll describes a real treasure or an idealized inventory or a religious fiction has been debated by scholars for 7 decades without resolution. Cave 4 was the most productive find. Discovered in 1952, again by the Tarahumara Bedouin before the archaeologists got there, Cave 4 contained fragments of approximately 900 different manuscripts, representing every book of the Hebrew Bible except Esther, multiple copies of important texts, and a vast quantity of previously unknown religious and sectarian literature. The fragments were in pieces, thousands of tiny pieces of parchment and papyrus, the result of 2,000 years of decomposition and the specific physical damage of the cave's collapse. The task of sorting, identifying, and assembling the fragments from Cave 4 would occupy a team of scholars for decades and would produce some of the most contentious scholarly disputes in the history of biblical archaeology. The site of Qumran itself, the ruins on the plateau above the caves, which the archaeologists excavated beginning in 1951 under the leadership of the Dominican archaeologist Roland de Vos, was identified as the community that had produced and preserved the scrolls. The Qumran community, almost universally identified with the Essenes, the Jewish sect described by the ancient historian Josephus as living a communal, ascetic life in the desert, devoted to purity and religious study, appears to have occupied the site from approximately the 2nd century BCE to 68 CE, when the site was destroyed by the Roman army during the suppression of the First Jewish Revolt. The identification of the Qumran community as Essenes, while not universally accepted, and while the specific relationship between the texts found in the caves and the community that lived at Qumran is still debated, provides the most coherent explanation for the scroll's presence in the caves. The community had a scriptorium, a writing room, where scrolls were copied. They had an extraordinary library of religious texts, biblical manuscripts, sectarian documents describing the community's own beliefs and practices, apocalyptic literature, wisdom texts, liturgical poetry. And when the Roman army moved through the region in 68 CE, destroying Jericho to the north and moving toward Jerusalem, the community apparently hid their most precious possessions in the surrounding caves, wrapped in linen and sealed in clay jars, and either were killed or fled without retrieving them. The scrolls waited in the caves for 19 centuries. Until a shepherd threw a stone. The texts themselves, the specific intellectual content of what the Dead Sea Scrolls contain, are the reason that the discovery transformed not just biblical scholarship but the entire understanding of the Second Temple period. the period of Jewish history from the return from Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE to the destruction of the Second Temple by Rome in 70 CE, in which both Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity had their origins. The sectarian texts, the texts that described the beliefs and practices of the Qumran community itself, revealed a form of Judaism of extraordinary richness and complexity. The community rule, the document that described the rules and practices of the sect, showed a community organized around concepts of ritual purity, communal property, a hierarchical leadership structure, and an apocalyptic theology that expected an imminent cosmic battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. The War Scroll described this cosmic battle in extraordinary military detail. The Temple Scroll, the longest of all the Dead Sea Scrolls at approximately 8.5 meters, described a visionary temple and a divine law code that differed in significant ways from the law of the Pentateuch. The parallels with early Christianity, the communal meals, the ritual bathing, the emphasis on purity, the hierarchical community structure, the apocalyptic expectation, the messianic theology, were immediately visible to the first scholars who read the sectarian texts and have been analyzed and debated ever since. The Dead Sea Scrolls do not prove that Jesus was an Essene or that Christianity originated in Qumran. The scholarly consensus firmly rejects both claims. But they reveal the specific Jewish religious environment of the 1st century CE in unprecedented detail, showing the specific diversity and the specific ferment of Second Temple Judaism in the period when both Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity were forming, and providing a context for understanding the earliest Christian texts that was simply unavailable before the scrolls were found. The scandal of the scrolls, the specific controversy that consumed Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship for decades and that generated more popular anger and more popular conspiracy theory than any other academic dispute in the history of biblical archaeology, was the delay in publication. The team of scholars assembled to publish the Cave 4 fragments in the early 1950s, a team that was initially entirely Christian, entirely male, and entirely composed of scholars with specific religious and institutional affiliations, controlled exclusive access to the unpublished fragments for decades, publishing some texts while leaving others unpublished for years that stretched into decades. By the 1980s, the situation had become a scandal. Scholars who were not members of the official team could not see the most important manuscript discovery in the history of their discipline. Theories about what the unpublished texts might contain, theories ranging from the plausible to the conspiratorial, some claiming that the Vatican was suppressing texts that would overturn Christianity, others that Israeli authorities were suppressing texts with political implications, circulated with the specific energy of conspiracies that feed on legitimate grievances. The resolution came in the early 1990s, partly through the specific dramatic act of the Huntington Library in California, which possessed a complete set of photographs of the unpublished fragments and announced in 1991 that it would make them available to all scholars, forcing the official team's hand. The full corpus of Dead Sea Scrolls texts has now been published. The massive multivolume series Discoveries in the Judean Desert, which runs to over 40 volumes, constitutes the official scholarly publication of the scrolls in their entirety. The scrolls are housed primarily in the Shrine of the Book, a purpose-built wing of the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, whose distinctive white dome was designed specifically to resemble the clay jar lids in which the scrolls were found. The Great Isaiah Scroll is displayed in a circular case under the dome, its 7.5 meters of text arranged in a ring, the oldest complete manuscript of any book of the Bible visible under carefully controlled lighting that preserves the ancient parchment while allowing visitors to see the specific ancient Hebrew script that a scribe wrote in approximately 125 BCE. Facsimiles of the scrolls are now available online. The Israel Antiquities Authority has produced high-resolution digital scans of the entire corpus, available through the Leon Levi Dead Sea Scrolls Digital Library, making the most important manuscripts in the history of biblical scholarship accessible to anyone with an internet connection in a way that would have seemed miraculous to the scholars who spent decades fighting for access to the originals. The shepherd Muhammad Edh Dib, who threw a stone into a cave and heard something break, lived to see his accidental discovery recognized as the most important manuscript find in history. He was interviewed multiple times by journalists and scholars, and his account of the discovery, varying in its details across different tellings, as oral accounts of remembered events always do, is the primary source for the specific moment when the silence of 2,000 years was broken by a thrown stone in the Judean desert. He needed a lost goat. He found the history of the world's religions. Some losses, it turns out, are the most important finds.